Right. All right, I think we should get started. We usually start right around 9:38. So thanks for coming out. And it's really nice that the snow didn't arrive as early as they said. So my wife texted me as I was driving and said, "What's it like?" And I said, "Just light drizzle. It's kind of nice, actually." So we'll see how long that lasts. But thank you for coming out. I asked Jeremiah to put this here, so in case you wanted to watch the hockey game in the Olympics, go USA, right? It's pretty exciting, actually. USA Canada for the first time in 46 years, I think. So hopefully they'll win the gold medal. But anyway, that's another story. The women already did. They were awesome. The women's team was amazing. They just like, yeah. And then the aerial skiing last night, I don't know if you guys saw that. That was really astonishing. They go up 60 feet and do all these spinny tricks and land on their feet. It's like, yeah, right. I'd land right on the gurney, right? So anyway, well, welcome this morning. We're picking up on the theme we started a couple weeks ago on loving enemies. Thank you. Do you think that one works okay now? Excellent. We have a mic because for the people online, even if I repeat the questions, they can't hear as clearly. So when there are questions, we'll run a mic out to people. So that'll hopefully help things. But we're looking now at the way the command of Jesus to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you was understood through the Christian tradition. And in the early church, I didn't include much from the early church because there really isn't a whole lot to say. They didn't really have a lot of variation on how they interpreted that. But as time went on, this teaching got woven into other teachings that are called councils of perfection that were seen to be not binding on all the baptized, but only on those who were willing to take these commandments on. And there are good reasons why that happened, interesting reasons as well. So, and the reason for that is found especially in like the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19. There are two instances of this. Jesus is asked by his adversaries. Moses says if a man gives his wife a certificate of divorce, he can divorce her. And Jesus says, well, it was not so from the beginning, right? And whatever God has joined together, let no one rend asunder. And then the disciples say, well, if that is the case, it's expedient not to marry. I just think that's really funny. We know what the attitude of the disciples was, right? And then Jesus says, not everyone can accept this teaching. So this is not a universal teaching, but only those to whom it is given. So it seems to be something that's given by grace. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. Right? So this would be celibacy, right? And this was viewed as a counsel of perfection, which is not binding on all the baptized, only on those who can accept it. And Paul says also, I wish everyone was like me, but if you can't be like me, it's better to marry than to burn. But he had another view of marriage than the disciples, right? Burn with passion. And then later, in the same chapter, this is Matthew 19, a rich young ruler comes up to Jesus and asks, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, you know the commandments. And he recites several of the commandments, but all from the second table. The young man said to him, I have kept all these. What do I still lack? And Jesus said to him, if you wish to be perfect, right, go sell your possessions, give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and then come follow me. So that was seen also as a counsel, not as a commandment, which would be very similar to the one about celibacy. If you have the gift to not marry and not have intercourse, basically, you can follow that. And if you have the desire to be perfect and not just follow the commandments, then sell your possessions and come follow me. So as you can imagine, in the early church, especially the development of monasticism, monks saw themselves, and nuns saw themselves as following these counsels, what they came to call counsels of perfection, that they're voluntarily embracing to love God even more ardently than you would just following the commandments. And I think the template really comes from that encounter with the rich young man. Jesus says, well, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Do the commandments. So he doesn't say that's not going to do it. But then the rich young man says, what do I still lack? And he says, well, sell your possessions, give to the poor, if you would be perfect, right? So poverty is not, in this interpretation, which was all through the church, poverty is not binding on every Christian, only on those who take it on themselves as a counsel of perfection. The question became, what about loving your enemies, right? Is loving your enemies a counsel of perfection, or is loving your enemies a commandment? Right, and the other commandment would be obedience. The other counsel, I mean, would be obedience, especially in the monastic world, obedience to your abbot. You would obey your abbot as having the voice of God. Or if you were a priest, you would obey your bishop in the same way. So, but the question became, what about loving enemies? Is that another one where if it is given to you, you can love your enemies, or is it every disciple must love their enemies? And interestingly, by the time of Thomas Aquinas, now we're in the 1200s, so we've jumped quite a bit, right, in the Middle Ages. By the time of Thomas Aquinas, the command to love enemies is a counsel of perfection. And it's linked with celibacy and poverty and obedience as being one of those counsels. So the reading I have for this morning comes from Thomas's discussion of counsels of perfection. And Thomas Aquinas was a major scholastic theologian, which means he worked in the schools. This is the beginning of Christian universities. And he studied in Paris and also worked in the University of Naples. And so they have they're trying to put in order Christian teaching and try to rationalize it in a very coherent way. So he has this wonderful style about how he is going to interpret these things. So he roots the whole thing, his discussion of these counsels of perfection, in charity, what they call charity, which is the English translation for caritas. And caritas is kind of a hybrid term between agape and eros. It has connotations of both. But charity would be the closest we would translate it as love. And he has a beautiful vision of the perfection of human life, and that is charity. Charity is the perfection of the human life. So the very opening quote in our reading today comes from the beginning of his discussion of the counsels of perfection. And he says, a thing is said to be perfect, which is a really interesting question. What did Jesus mean when he said, if you would be perfect? Right? It's not entirely clear what that meant. But he says here, a thing is said to be perfect insofar as it attains its proper end. You can see he read Aristotle, so that would be, which is the ultimate perfection thereof. Now it is charity that unites us to God, who is the last end of the human mind, since he that abideth in charity abideth in God, and God in him. Therefore, the perfection of the Christian life consists radically at the root in charity. So the Christian life consists in charity across the board, right? So this is a universal thing, that everything would be oriented toward charity. But then he said, perfection is said to consist in a thing in two ways. In one way, primarily and essentially, in another, secondarily and accidentally. Primarily and essentially, the perfection of the Christian life consists in charity, principally as to the love of God, and secondarily as to the love of our neighbor, both of which are the matter of the chief commandment of the divine law, as stated above. The reason of this is that the end of the commandment is charity, according to the apostle. Consequently, it is evident that perfection consists essentially in the observance of the commandments. What's interesting is, I don't know if people would say that today. Primarily love of God, secondarily love of neighbor. I think they'd say primarily love of neighbor, and maybe get around to loving God. I don't know. It's, at least in the broader Christian culture, I think there's a stronger emphasis on the horizontal than you see in Thomas. But anyway, he would definitely incorporate both of those, which is not very surprising. But then he says, secondarily and instrumentally, however, perfection consists in the observance of the counsels. So you can see already that this distinction between commandments and counsels is in the air. And he's just referring to this distinction. And you can see why it was developed. The commandment, or the becoming a eunuch, is only for those who have the capability, only to those to whom it is given. And the ruler is told, if you would be perfect. So it isn't like, it's not said the same way as observe the commandments. Now, elsewhere, just to give us some bad news, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells all the apostles to sell their possessions. There's no if you would be perfect. It's sell your possessions and give alms. So it's there's a bit of a tension there. But I can see why they saw the selling possessions as a counsel. So he said, secondarily and instrumentally, however, perfection consists in the observance of the counsels. So this is only secondary, all of which, like the commandments, are directed to charity, yet not in the same way. And so this is going to be the key, is all of these things are directed toward charity, then what's the difference, right? Why would there be a difference between the two? He says, for the commandments, other than the precepts of charity, are directed to the removal of things contrary to charity, with which, namely, charity is incompatible. Whereas the counsels are directed to the removal of things that hinder the act of charity, and yet are not directly contrary to charity, such as marriage, the occupation of worldly business, and so forth. So murder is directly contrary to charity. Adultery is directly contrary to charity, right? False witness is directly contrary to charity. Coveting your neighbor's goods is directly contrary to charity, and the commandments prohibit those things, right? And so the commandments guide us on the path of charity by keeping us away from the things that contradict charity. And then if you do commit one of these acts, there is the sacrament of penance and absolution. So you can be restored to the Christian path, but you've lost, if you've committed one of these acts, you've lost the gift of charity, and you need to repent and be absolved by the church. Counsels, on the other hand, don't remove things that are contrary to charity, because marriage is not contrary to charity. Being a householder is not contrary to charity. Having a business is not contrary to charity, right? This you could ask that now. Serving in the military is not contrary to charity. And Thomas would be in the world where that is definitely taught. And so if you renounce bearing arms, if you renounce wealth, if you renounce marriage and live a celibate, impoverished, obedient life, you're enhancing your charity, but you're not removing anything that contradicted it. And there was a lot of rhetoric at the time that didn't, I mean, he's actually very good on this, because there are other people who thought, if you're married, it's over, right? You have no chance, so, let alone if you're in the military or things like that. It's a very subtle distinction, but I think it's a really important one. So the charity is enhanced by celibacy. And Paul says that, the married man is anxious about the affairs of his wife. The unmarried man is anxious for the Lord, right? So it's better to be unmarried and be anxious for the Lord than to be married and be anxious about your wife. On the other hand, there's nothing wrong with being anxious about your wife. It's just a better state to be anxious for the Lord only. So that's the justification for this distinction between commandments and counsels. As I said, rhetorically, there were preachers from the monasteries that made it sound they're trying to recruit people, basically. And so they make it sound like if you live in the world, you're in real trouble. And there is something, one of the things I like about this period is there's something real about that, right? Our lives in the world are not a picnic, and they're not exactly paths toward charity, paths toward love. And so they're warning people, these are the preachers, not Aquinas, they're warning people that don't just think you're going to cruise along working for the state, being married and raising a family and all that thing, and have charity be the natural fruit of that, or be that the natural fruit of charity. So they're very concerned that the counsels of perfection set in our midst people who are living according to a higher call of charity, which then reminds us the ways we may be deviating from that path in very subtle or maybe not so subtle ways. It's hard to say, but I think that having both tracks present was a very interesting model. And of course, the Reformation does away with that. So we don't have examples of people living celibate, impoverished, and obedient lives alongside the rest of us. It seems too, the scholars have pointed out that in the early church, there were always householders with children and making a living and the like, and what they called ascetics. people who renounced the world, like the desert fathers and mothers, basically, but who lived in the congregation. And so each congregation had people in it who embodied a very different understanding of the Christian vocation. And that set a standard for everybody else to keep an eye on, right in their midst, like not reading a book about it or going on a retreat, right in their midst. And then unfortunately, I think these people started migrating out into the desert and then forming closed communities, cloistered communities. And so we didn't see them anymore, but we knew about them, right? The monks and the nuns were there. We just couldn't visit them. And there's a great Teresa of Avila, was a very social person. She's later than Aquinas, but part of her spiritual perfection was giving up social relations. So her family would come to see her, and she realized that that was holding her back. Even though she was in the cloister, that was holding her back. So she had to just wall herself off. So it's a very radical move. Oh, Julian, same thing. Yeah, she was an anchorite. And so as far as we know, she walled herself in at the back of the sanctuary. So, pardon me?
During Ephrata, also, they separated
yeah.
the householders from the...
Right. In fact, they didn't want householders. It's so, the cloisters, and that's a Protestant group, right? So this ideal doesn't go away. So that's really good. The Ephrata cloister is another example of this, and it looks exactly like what the Middle Ages looked like, which is you have this group that he wanted to withdraw to the wilderness. Good luck, right? And everyone heard, oh, Basil is out in the wilderness. Let's go with him. Something else, like the Desert Fathers, same thing happened to them. So all these people come out and join him, and they form a community. And then other people came, householders, farmers, and lived around the Ephrata cloister to support them, and also to gain benefit from their spiritual practice. And I think they worshipped with them also, but they didn't observe the same things that the people in the cloister did, like sleeping on wood with a wood block for a pillow, because they thought Jesus is coming at any minute, so sleeping is a really bad idea. You want to be awake. So the householders didn't live that way, but they lived close to it so that they could participate as much as they could in the spiritual force field, if you will, of the Ephrata cloister. Yeah, and that was very common. This is true also in Tibet. Unfortunately, the communists have done a real job on Tibetan Buddhism, but each town has a monastic community at one end and at the other end. And so the monastery is really the anchor of the community, and the monks are the teachers of the community. So even in the Buddhist tradition, you see the same kind of model. But thank you for that. The Ephrata cloister is a perfect example. And Basil would be, yes, if you feel that you've been given the gift to live this way, then please do. If you don't, don't. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? So, but if you want to make sure, he was the same way. If you want to make sure that when Jesus returns, you're going to be standing, then come live with us. So yeah, Gay, did you have
when Cloister Group was really by the dates and everything else, conducting the mass with the priest for them, and we're sitting with full the house
right
and everything else. But it's a wonderful moment because they're just the chanting is beautiful, the voices have to be a female. I remember listening to better. All his art, incredible art historian, came out and made all these programs. Great to retire.
There you go. Yeah. No, thank you for that. So it's about the beauty of worship. If you go to a cloistered community, they're usually behind what's called the rood screen. And so we're sitting out in the main sanctuary. And that's why actually the structure of St. James very much echoes that, right? So the monks would sit up in the chancel, and then we would sit, but we wouldn't see them, or the nuns. We wouldn't see them. There would be a screen separating us, but we'd hear everything, right? And the priest would be up at the high altar conducting mass, but then the monks or the nuns would sing the service, and it really is. It's absolutely transcendent. And so there was not a sequestering. That was the only time people from the community could be with the monks or the nuns, but it was a beautiful thing because that's what most abbeys were. They had a public worship section connected with the abbey. That's why Westminster Abbey is so huge, right? Is that the community in London was able to participate in that service. So yeah, thank you. That's another place in which this influence of the monastic community on the larger community was very much in force. and part of the organic life of the group. And the awareness was, at any given time, like this woman, you could receive the gift of a cloistered life, right? So it isn't like you just have to decide this when you're 13 or something. And that also is a very South Asian practice. The Hindus have this idea that when your children are raised, you and your wife can actually renounce the world and withdraw to an ashram and spend the rest of your life there. So it's a practice that was done for long, thousands of years, and still may be practiced today. So so this is exactly this pattern, right? So all of us in the congregation are following the commandments, hopefully, but then there are those in the chancel who are following the counsels. But it's not like they're leaving us behind. Although the Desert Fathers and Conrad Beisel tried to leave us behind, right? But we followed them. I think that's really interesting, is that there's this magnetic draw toward people who really catch fire with charity, right? And their lives are just completely oriented to God. And you see it in the way they live. Martin Luther King Jr. preached a sermon on Mahatma Gandhi, and he said, the greatest Christian of the 20th century was Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi wasn't a Christian, right, by any means, but he said the way he dedicated his life to service to God and to others and gave up everything. He lived a life of poverty. He dressed like an untouchable, like a Dalit. And so King was deeply impressed by that too. So that would be another example of somebody from the 20th century who lived this exemplary life of self-renunciation, had a huge influence on the world, actually. I wish his influence would come back. It's kind of died off. We need to get Gandhi back. But anyway, isn't that wild that he called him the greatest Christian of the 20th century? So anyway, so that idea is not unique to Christianity. The Buddhists have a similar idea, Hindus have a similar idea, etc. But the question then becomes, is love your enemies a counsel? Or is it a commandment? That's the question. The other two are pretty easy because Jesus says, to whom it is given, they can become eunuchs for the kingdom. To whom it is, if you would be perfect, sell your possessions, etc. So Aquinas goes on to say that the commandments of the old law are binding, but the counsels are given with liberty, of the law of liberty, and therefore counsels are about matters that render the gaining of this end more assured and expeditious, but they both will reach the same end, right? And so spiritual goods are the goal, and the things of this world can hinder that. So if you give up things of this world voluntarily, you'll attain the end of spiritual goods more quickly. And so he says at the end of that long paragraph toward the end, he will attain more speedily thereto by giving up the goods of this world entirely. Wherefore the evangelical counsels are given for this purpose. And then he goes on to talk about the three things that hinder charity, which are external wealth, carnal pleasures, and honors. I think that's really interesting, that honors. It's right at the bottom of page 1. The three things that hinder charity are external wealth, pertaining to the concupiscence of the eyes, carnal pleasures, pertaining to the concupiscence of the flesh, and honors, which pertain to the pride of life. And he won an award for saying that. No, I'm kidding. That last one we don't think about really at all. Honors. Seeking honors is really not a good thing. And, we see this in the Olympics. They're just like, I dream about winning the gold medal and all that. And so it's like, that's embedded in us. It's like, well, that's pride, right? That's seeking honor. So if you actually make that the goal of your life, you've lost charity, Aquinas would say. Right? My one goal is to get a gold medal in the Olympics, and I love these people, so I'm not criticizing them, but I'm just saying what Thomas would say, and it is interesting actually to think about. And it is in renouncing these altogether as far as possible that the evangelicals' counsels consist. Okay, so that's why they would take on poverty to resist external wealth, chastity to actually the word should be celibacy, because chastity is all of our physical relations are supposed to be chaste. Like married people are supposed to practice chastity. So celibacy would be the better word there. And the pride of life by the bondage of obedience. So it's hard to have pride when your abbot's telling you everything what to do, or your bishop is telling you everything what to do. So those are the hindrances that would get in the way of charity growing the way it should. And so if you get rid of those, your charity will grow more speedily, but your charity will still be there if you're obeying the commandments, right? If that makes sense. Then the question becomes, and gets us to page 2, are the words about Jesus about loving enemies, praying for those who persecute you, doing good to those who do evil to you, are those counsels or are those commandments? And Thomas clearly thinks they're counsels, which is interesting. So he says, now if a man observe these, the counsels, absolutely, that is in accordance with the counsels as they stand. I'm sorry, I must have had a typo there. But if a man observe any one of them, so you can observe them absolutely, which would be a kind of vowed life, right? So observing them absolutely would be living in a cloister, in poverty and obedience and celibacy. But you could actually observe them in a particular case, even if you're not a vow under vows. So he says this is taking the counsel in a restricted sense, namely as applying to that particular case. So for instance, I could actually give up my wealth at a certain instance without vowing that I do that for the rest of my life. And these are the examples he gives. For instance, when anyone gives alms to a poor man, not being bound to do so, okay, he follows the counsels in that particular case. Is he not bound to do so? That's my question. And again, when a man follows not his will to do some deed which he might do lawfully, he follows the counsel in that particular case. For instance, if he do good to his enemies when he is not bound to, or if he forgive an injury of which he might justly seek to be avenged.
Would that person be following the commandments when he's doing that without being bound?
That's what Thomas is saying, is loving your enemies is not binding. But you could do it, but that would just be following a counsel in a particular case. Or forgiving someone might be something you could do, but you're not bound to forgive those who wrong you. You could also seek to avenge the wrong. Yes, Gay.
The one is, well, what does it mean then to have your righteousness received out of the Pharisees? And how do then we fall on the Christ's commandment as well, that if you sin in your heart, it is as bad as if you had done it in the flesh? So that seems to me that wouldn't be a counsel, it would be the other.
Right, it would be a commandment, right? Yeah. So no, that's a great, so the question becomes, how is he making this distinction between things Christ says elsewhere, like when you pray like this? Well, is that a counsel, or is he teaching us to pray that way? There's not a Christian through history who thought that was just advice, right? To pray more expeditiously. It was viewed in a way as binding, but not as eliminating other forms of prayer. No one ever thought that, but as being the archetype of what a prayer is, and everybody taught that. So that's in the same section. That's in the Sermon on the Mount. So if he's going into the Sermon on the Mount now, not Matthew 19, but Matthew 5 through 7, and sorting out, no, this is a counsel of perfection. What are the other things that Jesus says there that are counsels of perfection? That's the question, right? Because forgive and you will be forgiven. And he says, if you don't forgive, God won't forgive you. And then Thomas says, for instance, if you do good to his enemies when he's not bound to, or if you forgive an injury which he might justly seek to be avenged. Right? So forgiveness becomes optional. It becomes a counsel. And doing good to an enemy becomes a counsel. Right? Actually, Moses doesn't even teach that. Moses teaches to do good to your enemy. The book of Proverbs teaches do good to your enemy. It doesn't say love your enemy, but it certainly doesn't say it's optional to do good to your enemy. So it's a really interesting question where this came from. And I think it comes from the realization that you can't serve in the military or you can't be a police officer and love your enemies. You can't, right? In fact, in the military, my brother taught me this. He went to Vietnam, and he said, you can't actually will to kill the enemy until they kill somebody you know, until it becomes personal. And then you hate them because they killed your friend or your friends, right? And so in the medieval world, they're very aware of just how awful warfare is and how awful even the police force is, et cetera, state control. And so the awareness is you can't, if you can serve in the military as a Christian, which is a really good question, right? Our Amish and Mennonite brothers and sisters think we're crazy that we opened this door and we walked into it, and that's why we're in this muddle. But if you can, in fact, serve in the military, serve in the police, be a hangman, right? Be an executioner, inject people with lethal drugs as a Christian, then you can't follow what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. You can't love your enemy. You can't turn the other cheek. You can't resist not evil, right? And imagine what the world would look like if every Christian lived that way. If everyone who thinks they're a Christian didn't resist evil. If everyone who thinks they're a Christian loved their enemies and did good to those who persecute them, right? And turned the other cheek and gave more than what was stolen and never sought any of it back, never went to court, never filed a lawsuit. God forbid. I mean, in the early church, if you went to court and filed a lawsuit, you'd be excommunicated. Like, what are you doing? Right? So, you don't submit the spiritual life to temporal judgment. So anyway, there are lots of things that get mixed together in the Christian life by this period and even earlier. And so what they're trying to do is figure out, well, how can you still be a soldier in the army and be a Christian? Well, you can't follow. I mean, it must be a counsel of perfection to love your enemies, because you can't love your enemies when you're killing them. Luther thought you could. I remember my ethics professor, James Gustafson of blessed memory, said, we were studying Luther's sermons on the Sermon on the Mount. So we're jumping ahead several hundred years, but and Luther says, you can love your enemy even as you're killing him. And Gustafson, who'd served in the Korean War, said, nice try. You can't, he said the same thing my brother did. You can't kill the enemy until you hate him, until it's personal. And that includes dropping bombs and all sorts of things. So anyway, yeah, you're on a run.
In the world today as Christians, it doesn't take evil serious.
Right.
How do you resist evil? Which we ought to learn what to do. And I go back to, I'm old enough to have had half my family in World War II. Mm-hmm. So, how do you resist the indoctrination of evil, the violence of evil? Mm-hmm. It isn't subjective. There is.
Oh no. No.
And unfortunately, it comes to us from evil.
Mm-hmm. It comes to us from inside of us. It comes to us right here. Right. It's all in there. Yeah, so no, that's a really good question. So the way this would be, and we'll get to this especially because this becomes a really pressing issue in the 20th century and in our country. And so we'll read two people toward the end of this series, Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr., treating each one a different Sunday, because that was Gandhi's question. It was nonviolent resistance, right? So it's resistant. That's a phrase, though, that the early church and this period wouldn't have. They wouldn't have nonviolent resistance. But what you're doing when you're following a counsel of perfection, not to retaliate, because monks weren't allowed to carry swords, which meant that they could be, but again, they don't have any property, so who would want to rob them, But anyway, what you're doing, that's the greatest resistance to evil, because striking your neighbor is evil. Right? It's on a trajectory to hating your neighbor leads to murder, right? And you see that actually in Genesis, that Esau sees what Jacob did to him by stealing his blessing and hates him and wants to kill him. Joseph's brothers see how much their father loves him and how much he dotes on him and gives him the special coat and all that stuff. And then Joseph acts like a total jerk and rats on his brothers and stuff, gives an evil report, and they hate him and they want to kill him. So hatred leads to the desire to kill, and killing is definitely against charity, and hatred is definitely against charity. So the way we resist evil is don't hate, forgive, Love your enemy. Do good to those who do evil to you. By doing that, you're taking evil out of the world. You're reducing the energy of evil. Because evil is hatred, evil is retaliation, evil is the way we condemn each other, evil is the way we judge each other. So that's actually resistance. We're resisting evil by not resisting. It's a very paradoxical thing. But we'll get to that more when we get to the 20th century, because that becomes the major issue. Is the phrase that they coined, and Gandhi comes up with it because of the Sanskrit term ahimsa, which is nonviolence. It's nonviolent resistance. And so it's that combination. In the Christian world, Jesus says, resist not evil. But what Gandhi would say is, yeah, he completely agreed with that. But he would say that you resist evil nonviolently, but you have to resist it for the sake of love. Right? So if you love, you're resisting evil. I mean, we will get to that. It's interesting that that's not something Thomas is that interested in. But he is in a way, because he's interested in the things that either enhance charity or contradict charity. So, and charity is charity is the cure to evil, right? So we are sinners, and what God does to make us whole is infuse love for God into us by the Holy Spirit. And that's what resists evil. So the more you live out of love, the more you're resisting evil. There's no question that that's what he thinks. And the more radically you live out of love, like poverty, celibacy, and obedience, the more you're resisting evil, right? So that would be the way he would, and I don't think we think about it that way, actually. But it also means that you don't resist Hitler by bombing him, right? Which means that you may very well lose in a temporal sense. In fact, you probably will lose in a temporal sense. And King points this out. Gandhi was assassinated at a fairly young age. Jesus was assassinated or killed at a very young age. A lot of his followers were killed. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So all these people who follow this path usually don't have a very long shelf life, but they're transformative, right? They're transformative. People can live to 90 and not have the influence these people had. So it's a really interesting question, though. Do we really think that Jesus is telling us the truth in the Sermon on the Mount? Sam gave me this, that his daughter gave him. I don't know if you can read it. It says, OMG, you guys, that's not what I said. It's Jesus lamenting. So we can figure out if we've gotten what he said correctly. So just to look at what Thomas says about loving enemies, because Calvin will be responding to this next week. The next paragraph is, he says, our Lord said, and this is where he takes up this command that we've been looking at, our Lord said, love your enemies. Love of one's enemies may be understood in three ways. First, as though we were to love our enemies as such. Love them because they're our enemies. And this is perverse and contrary to charity, since it implies love of that which is evil in another. So that makes sense, right? You don't love Adolf Hitler because he's doing what he's doing. By the way, a friend of mine has written a book on how Adolf Hitler has become the standard of moral judgment, right? So, well, you would never do that. I mean, just look at how many times Hitler comes up. It's the exemplar of the worst, right? And I just did it without even thinking about it anyway. So you don't love a murderer because he's a murderer. That's what he means. You don't love them for that reason. That would be perverse and contrary to charity, since it implies love of that which is evil in another. I mean, Hannibal Lecter loved other cannibals, right? But that's not a good thing. Secondly, love of one's enemies may mean that we love them as to their nature, as their human nature, but in general, right? And in this sense, charity requires that we should love our enemies. Namely, that in loving God and our neighbor, we should not exclude our enemies from the love given to our neighbor in general. That's interesting. So you love your neighbor in general, and then you love your enemy as part of that in general. I'm not quite sure what that means. There's a great section, and I'm not meaning to pull the rug out from under Thomas, but I think of this every time I read this. In Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, I think it is, it's one of his novels, he talks about this Christian missionary who preached love and then hated people. She was just an impossible person. And the character says, so-and-so, Dorothea or whoever, loved humanity in general and hated people in particular. So it sounds like Thomas is saying we love our enemies and our neighbors in general, but not in any one particular case. And that's because of the third paragraph, the next paragraph. He says, thirdly, love of one's enemies may be considered as specially directed to them, namely that we should have a special movement of love towards our enemies. Isn't that what Jesus says? Love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you, bless those who curse you. He says, charity does not require this absolutely, because it does not require that we should have a special movement of love to every individual man, since this would be impossible. Well, that's not actually what's being said. You should have a movement of love toward that particular person, right, who's your enemy. Nevertheless, charity does require this in respect of our being prepared in mind, namely that we should be ready to love our enemies individually if the necessity were to occur. So I should be ready to love my enemy if I ever had to. When would that be? I mean, I thought Jesus told us to do that. And now I'm telling him, will I be ready to do that if it ever were necessary? Now, lest we think this is goofy, I think we all think this way, right? I would renounce my goods in the world if it were necessary. I would be willing to die for God in the name of Christ if it were necessary. God help me if it's ever necessary, right? So we all have this kind of lie to ourselves that we would do all the things Jesus asked us to do if it were necessary, if that time actually came. And sometimes people do amazing things when the time comes. But the question is here, when would that be necessary if it isn't necessary now? It's really interesting, actually, that he makes this move. That man should actually do so and love his enemy for God's sake without it being necessary for him to do so belongs to the perfection of charity. So it's a level higher than the commandment. So he puts this commandment in a council, clearly, love your enemy. And as I said, socially, he has a very good reason to do that, because how can you love your enemy when it's your job to kill them, right? You can't. I don't think we think about this. I don't think we think about it. But Jesus, if Jesus is teaching, if we really thought that this is what Jesus actually said, and he meant it, the world would look the Christian world would look very different. What would it look like the Mennonite and Amish communities around us? And we've done a nice job. We've kind of made them into the monastics. It's like they're doing the Jesus work for us, and we're kind of like benefiting from that. Thank God somebody's living nonviolently, forgiving their enemies. Do you remember when what was it? You'll all remember this, the school shooting. Nickel school shooting was very local. And the community immediately forgave the shooter and embraced his family and all of that. And everyone's like, all these Christians like, oh my God, that's amazing. How did you do that? It's so astonishing. And why would you do that? And they're like, aren't you Christians? Have you read the New Testament? We do this every single day. In fact, a friend of mine who's evangelical and Reformed, but German Reformed, but now part of the United Church of Christ, lived in a Mennonite elderly home, or CCRC basically. And he asked someone, why do you only have communion twice a year? Don't you like the Eucharist? We crank it out every week, right? And they said, well, the reason is before every communion, because Jesus said, if you're coming and giving your gift at the altar and you find out somebody has something against you, leave the gift, go back to your neighbor, be reconciled, and then come back to the temple. And by the way, he's talking about a walk from Galilee to Jerusalem, back and back. So it's quite a dramatic thing. They said, we have to go around to every member of our community before every communion and find out if there's any reason that there's some alienation between us and try to reconcile that. Same thing happens in the Jewish community, by the way, before Yom Kippur. The whole month of Elul is spent touching base. It's like 12-step program. It's touching base with everyone who may have a reason to feel that you have done something against them. And so if you live that way, before every communion, you go to everyone in the community and make sure that your relationship is one of love, then of course, when somebody shoots your children in the school, you'll be prepared to love them, right? So a lot of it is daily, no, all of it is daily practice, right? It isn't, if my enemy ever were to, I probably hope I'd love them. It's like, no, you just practice this with each other, right? The passing of the peace, for instance, which luckily it doesn't become the huge Super Bowl celebration thing here that it can in some churches. The passing of the peace was so that you would go seek out the person you know you're estranged from in order to be reconciled before communion. Right? It wasn't just greeting people around you, which is fine, but it was passing the peace was to make sure everyone's reconciled before you take communion, because if you're not reconciled, you're in trouble. But you shouldn't go to communion. There's a story I'll tell very briefly, but it does have to do with this. And I think we got the main points across. There was a story a friend of mine told from an Episcopal parish, and he was a priest, and this parishioner came to him as a woman and said, I'm in a real pickle. I've been a lifelong member of this congregation. My husband married me and he became a member, but this is my parish, and he's having an affair with another woman. And our marriage is ending. But she said he brings him to church every Sunday. So she and he are there in my church, and they go up and have communion. And I can't go to communion if they're here, which I totally get. And this, of course, is unheard of in the Episcopal Church, right? And so the priest didn't know what to do. And finally he said, okay, I have an idea. I'm not going to single them out, but I'll just make an announcement before the service. So he said, it has come to my attention that there are those in our congregation who are not living in love and charity toward their neighbor and who are acting in violation of that love. And I would ask you, please not to come up for communion today. 4 people went up for communion. And 4 people. Good for them, right? So if we really thought that was the case, that we couldn't go up to communion if we were estranged from someone in the congregation, and that would include people who aren't necessarily there, would we go? Right? I just thought that was so interesting. And that used to be, back when communion was fenced and you had to go to confession ahead of time and everything, that was the reason, is to find out, are you alienated from God and your neighbor? If you are, you can't go to communion. Right? So these questions, all that to say is that the Amish were like, why are you so surprised by this? We practice forgiving those who have offended us all the time, and doing good to those who do wrong to us all the time. It's really quite remarkable. So anyway, we'll look next time we get to John Calvin and his views on loving enemies. And one of the things he's going to go after is loving your enemies a counsel of perfection? And on the other hand, then we can ask Calvin a bunch of questions. Well, if it isn't a counsel of perfection, then what about X, Y, and Z? So anyway, but yes, sir.
Quick interruption. US 1, Canada 0.
US 1, Canada 0. And we say that in all humility, right? So let us just chant quietly. USA, USA. Thank you for that. I hope it continues. So thank you. I look forward to seeing you next week. And it looks like the snow might just be beginning. So